Hello and welcome to the Mental Disorder Podcast. I'm Jonah Davids, and my guest today is Carolyn Gorman, who is a Paulson Policy Analyst at the Manhattan Institute studying mental health policy. Carolyn, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jonah.
So you're here today because I want to talk about your new report, School-Based Mental Health Initiatives, Challenges and Considerations for Policymakers. Now, this is a report that basically looks at what is school-based mental health, what are the different school-based mental health interventions, the history, and you look at the effectiveness, kind of look at everything. What made you want to delve into this topic in the first place?
Yeah, so I am not primarily an education researcher. My research interests have been oriented actually towards the adult population with very serious and persistent mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. I'm a New Yorker. And so, most New Yorkers can see sort of how palpable the failures of mental health policy have been when they see people deteriorating on the subway platforms and sort of see the spillover of mental health into other systems like criminal justice and homelessness. So I started getting more interested in the youth population, though, because there's been a lot of momentum around youth mental health in the past few decades. COVID certainly catalyzed that. And in particular, related to school-based programming, there's been sort of more noise. And having worked a little bit around issues related to the adult population and seeing how the criminal justice system has become the de facto mental health system for adults, a lot of the push towards school-based services for youth kind of gave me a lot of similar vibes. And so, we have been doing a lot around school-based mental health and doing it for long enough that I think it's worth kind of taking stock of what we've done and trying to figure out whether or not it's an approach we do want to double down on.
Right. So maybe we can just start by kind of defining, when we say school-based mental health, you kind of give 3 tiers of different types of interventions. Can you talk about those tiers and just maybe give an example for each?
Yeah, of course. So there is a wide array of programs, interventions, and services that are offered in schools that are kind of related to mental health or mental health oriented. There's no single agreed upon framework or definition for what a comprehensive set of school-based programs would consist of. But there's general agreement in education and mental health circles that the way we can think about it is this. There's sort of a tiered structure, and you might think of a triangle with the skinny point at the top. At the bottom of that triangle is universal programs. So these are programs that are being delivered to all students regardless of need. Then you have sort of a second middle tier that are more targeted programs, and then a narrower tier of even more individualized programs and services. So to start back at this universal tier, each tier really has a preventative tone to it, because right now the sort of a primary goal in mental health policy is to prevent mental illness. And the way that we do that currently, or trying to do that, I should say, is through improving emotional wellness among all people, regardless of whether or not they might be predispositioned to developing a mental illness. So universal programs might be awareness programs or social emotional learning programs that are meant to sort of make people aware of emotional states and introduce signs and potential symptoms of mental disorders. So that way people are more likely to seek treatment. And the idea is that this early intervention would prevent mental illness. We've been doing this for like nearly a half century, and it hasn't actually worked. We haven't prevented mental illness this way, so it's just worth saying that right up front, that because we don't know yet what causes mental illnesses definitively, we can't actually prevent it, and so this upstream approach is going to be limited. In this sort of second tier, we might have individual or group counseling sessions, or even sort of deeper application of these curricula of universal programs for a subset of students that might be considered to be at risk of developing a mental disorder. The characteristics that we tend to use to consider someone at risk might be family history, family characteristics, overt behaviors, and also adversity. So if you are a young person who is experiencing a lot of adversity, often we treat that as a flag, as something that could potentially cause mental illness, and try to kind of intervene preemptively. Tier 3 are sort of the most specialized services, and these would be much more intensive services that would be reserved for youth with symptoms of diagnosed mental disorders or behaviors that look like symptoms of mental disorders. So programs or services that include referrals to outside providers might be included in this group. This is sort of the least common to occur in the typical neighborhood school, just because they're least likely to be needed. But there's an important point to make about where we're putting resources, and where we are putting resources right now is really at this sort of universal level that has, unfortunately, really marginal benefit and under-discussed potential harms.
I think there's quite a few programs in schools now that are structured like that. So I'm thinking of different, they call it response to intervention programs. So you'll have things for behavior that also have this tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 type of thing. Sometimes it's true for academics. And so tier 1 is universal. It's either universal, say, instruction, say, in reading or language, or maybe it's behavior. Everyone is told these are the rules. Tier 2 is the kids who've got trouble with that. You put them in smaller groups. They have individual work, or they get, maybe it's some kind of group therapy type thing for behavior to try and calm them down. And then tier 3 would be like one-on-one specialized, individualized help. Often you try and do that in the school, but yeah, if they have to, an outside service. So this is kind of something that I think schools are doing across the board, this 3-tiered structure. And the idea, I think, in their minds is, to get as many kids kind of into this funnel as possible, with the hope of identifying the ones who, need the most help and preventing kids from slipping through the cracks, so to speak.
Yep, I think that's right. And one thing to sort of point out or be clear about is I don't see an issue with a tiered structure necessarily. I think triage in general is kind of the right approach. You want to give the most services and the most intensive services to the kids who need them the most. The problem is, what are sort of the conceptual topics being discussed, and what are the goals of the program? So you sort of have a scale question, a scope question, and also actually a speed question. And I think these 3 things are very relevant to mental health programming. From a scale perspective, okay, how many students are we exposing to mental health treatments? From a scope perspective, how deeply conceptually are we exposing kids to mental health concepts, and even concepts like suicide, which I think we should particularly be concerned about raising, especially for kids at very young ages. These are really complicated topics, and we should be thoughtful about what the scope of their discussion is. And then the speed. How fast are we sort of implementing these programs? Are we implementing them before the evidence really supports their implementation? Unfortunately, with a lot of universal programs, there either is evidence that would not support application of universal programs, or missing evidence. So evidence that's not really strong enough yet to suggest that the programs are worth doing.
And what do you think explains the rushing ahead here?
I think right now there's a real sense of urgency because there's a lot of noise around a perceived youth mental health crisis. And don't get me wrong, I think there are certainly some concerning things going on, but we also should be very careful about the ways that we are kind of, medicalizing social problems or just problems of human life. teens are going to experience a lot of ups and downs, and it's important to kind of help give young people a useful baseline for what a real problem is, or what is something that's not worth getting upset over, and sort of gritting through. So I think the urgency is sort of stemming from this perceived crisis, and I don't think that the urgency is an excuse to continue doubling down on what we've been doing without giving more thought to whether the premise of school-based mental health itself is the approach that we want to take. So a lot of times in policy research, you sort of read white papers that say, our study did not find this program effective, but it still shows promise. Well, we have been doing school-based mental health in various capacities for a couple decades now, and I'm not sure that the promise has been realized. On the opposite side of that, there are some real challenges with sort of administering mental health treatments through the education system, and those warrant more discussion. So one goal that I had for this paper was just to sort of clearly spell out those challenges and trade-offs and potential downsides so that policymakers can give those more consideration than the sort of mental health industry-driven narrative of therapy is good for everyone, which is not the case.
Right, because let's say there's a youth mental health crisis, which I think the evidence, supports, and it's complicated, but let's just establish that there is. If we had interventions that we weren't sure about, but we didn't think there was much of a downside, then what's the harm, right? Like maybe meditation is going to help kids. What's the worst that could happen? Let's do it. Maybe, talking about your problems in a group setting with all the kids in your class could help them. What's the worst that could happen? Let's do it. If there's no possible downside, no possible harm, and if it's not changing anything, negatively, then it would seem like an okay idea to try it. But as you talk about in this report, talking about mental health, engaging in therapy or in mental health practices, and especially when you're doing it, not say from a licensed psychiatrist, but from say a teacher or a school counselor, there are harms that can happen to kids, both in terms of the experiences that they have, the information that they may divulge and share to their peers, and then also to the way that it makes them think about their own experiences, their own suffering. And, this can lead to certainly over pathologization of everyday life experiences, which I also think I almost feel like we're at this point now where that has almost turned into a real mental health issue, to the point where once kids are in the habit of thinking about all their issues as, mental illness or anxiety or depression, then they will go and they will get meds, and meds have side effects. And then suddenly they're in side effects and they're going to therapy and they're talking about their problems. And like this alone can create these feedback loops that can then, actually probably create real suffering.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you sort of looped around to that point, because I don't like to call this a youth mental health crisis. And the reason I don't like doing that is because, yes, I think there are some challenges that youth are facing right now, but calling it a youth mental health crisis, I worry, legitimizes mental health specific interventions as the preferential intervention. But they shouldn't be. So let's just for a second talk about mental health treatment, not for youth in schools, just mental health treatment in general, because I think that's a useful kind of baseline. Mental health treatment is not great, and it's definitely limited. A primary reason for this is because it's not curative. We don't know what the causes of all mental illnesses are. We can understand some associations, what might increase someone's risk of developing a mental illness, but unlike medical disorders, there are no biomarkers for mental illnesses. And so we can't prevent mental illness if we don't know what causes it, and we can't cure mental illness if we don't know what causes it. So that in and of itself is a limitation. I think when you recognize that, then you're really thinking about treatment as kind of symptom management alone. And as you said, mental health treatments introduce their own symptoms. You've got antipsychotic medications that have really tough side effects for patients. Stimulant overuse can induce psychosis. That's very scary given the rates that we are diagnosing kids with ADHD and prescribing for that. And psychotherapy also can really lead us to like ruminate and, just as you were saying, kind of get ourselves into a mindset that is not productive or helpful for overcoming whatever circumstances are in. So mental health treatment, I think, is limited, and that should suggest that we use it judiciously. The benefits should definitely be outweighing the costs if you're going to use mental health treatment. For someone who's, homeless and schizophrenic, here's a clear example of someone who really has a case to be made to get mental health treatment. But for a young person, where we don't actually know for sure if it is a mental disorder a lot of times, most mental disorders for most people develop in late teens, early 20s. So we're talking about sort of the wrong target population right off the bat to very confidently say, in most cases, that this is a mental illness worth treatment. Aside from that, a lot of mental illnesses like anxiety and depression are transitory and tend to resolve themselves over time. So just waiting it out could be a more effective treatment with fewer side effects. All this to say, we don't want to just leave kids with no resources. And so I empathize with the idea of trying to, get kids resources through a diagnosis. But I think we need to really recognize and consider the drawbacks here, and instead be thinking a lot more about structural interventions.
Structural interventions like what?
Not mental health treatments. You had mentioned sort of like who's providing these services. So a teacher might be, for example, incorporating sort of pop psychology concepts into their coursework. Teachers don't want to do this a lot of times. They are nervous about sort of what they know and what they don't know, and this is not their expertise. We're sort of asking them to serve as therapists without having them trained to do this. Okay, so what are schools well equipped to do that could help underlying adversity that a lot of kids face? One thing they could do is just be open, be a place where kids can go if, for example, they have an unstable home life or an unsafe home life. Are there resources that we can give schools to kind of keep their doors open after hours? Are there, other kind of programs and opportunities that we can offer through schools that might help address other underlying adversity? I'm a big proponent of literacy programs. If you're a student who's behind because of COVID and you're actually really struggling to just read, that's going to have a bad effect on how you feel about yourself. So are we going to give that kid mental health treatment that has a lot of sort of low quality treatment out there when we could give them a literacy program? If we're talking about what a school is capable of doing, a school has a clear comparative advantage to sort of do the thing that's within their wheelhouse. And so it would be great to see more alignment towards those types of interventions.
Right. Another example that I think is good is like school lunches. That's something where it's obviously expensive, but if you did that, that is going to help a lot of kids in a lot of ways. And that's an easy, like, anti-poverty, pro-focus intervention, right? And something like that it's not nebulous. Like, it's very well shown that you can do this and that kids are happier and they're fed, right? And you at least kind of know that these are the outcomes that you're going to get.
Yeah, I'd love to see more like recess even, or gym class. We know that, physical activity is good for people and how they feel. So instead of requiring teachers to incorporate social emotional learning concepts, which are sort of just like these nebulous ideas, these programs are all different. No one actually knows what this means. It means different things to different people. And is social and emotional learning not sort of completely inherent to what a school is anyway? Like, why is a required curriculum the thing that has to be taught when a school itself is somewhere where kids are going to socially develop and emotionally develop?
Do you know, like, the history of SEL, like why they do it that way, like the theory behind it?
No, I don't.
It's based on, it's not Howard Gardner. It's one of these psychologists from like Harvard or whatever, and he wrote a book called like Emotional Intelligence. And I think he wrote this in the 90s or 2000s. And the premise of the book was that, EQ, emotional intelligence, is actually more predictive of success in life and career than IQ. Now, that's been pretty debunked. And like the most easy debunk of it is that, IQ and EQ are like quite correlated. And IQ seems to explain more of EQ than the other way around and all these kinds of things. But this is the idea. So that guy then went on to found Castle with one of the Rockefellers, actually, which is kind of funny. So the psychologist pushing emotional intelligence in a Rockefeller, like they found Castle, which is the social emotional learning organization. And the idea is basically you need to teach kids emotional intelligence because that's actually more important than teaching them like normal intelligence, which is not something that, I guess to some degree it can be taught, but their idea is this is more important than other stuff. And so that's why it's kind of expanded, because the ideology behind it, the theory behind it, debunked, but behind it nevertheless, is that this is actually more important than being like, really, really strong at math or reading or something. And this is actually, I think, merged very, very well with corporations and their interests, because a lot of corporations, they want people in the workplace who are basically quite, well behaved, and they have good social skills and they're polite. And it's very true. Like, you might be a really great person, really bright, but if you don't know how to like talk to people well, and you're rude and you don't really fit in. So I think a lot of them also support this because they see it as a way to kind of prime students over time to essentially like, this is how you fit into corporate life socially and emotionally. And so there's kind of this meeting of the minds there. And I think that's why it's expanded so much.
Yeah, I mean, this SEL seems to me like one of those exemplar ideas that conceptually like sound good, right? Like, yeah, we want people to know how to behave in social settings and be aware of how they're feeling and how other people are feeling. But I think when you actually look at the concrete kind of definitions and what's actually being delivered, how do we measure this type of thing? Again, are we not sort of inherently teaching kids how to interact appropriately by nature of having to be in social settings with their peers and sort of successfully get through just the school environment? And that's sort of where I have more question about it. There are so many programs, and for some schools, they may be implementing something and it works for them and they see success. And I think it's important for schools to do what works for them. But I think there is just such a vast kind of array of programs and such variation in outcomes. Implementation has not been consistent. For all these reasons, I think requiring these types of programs would not be an approach that I think is beneficial. It would be restrictive for schools that have their own successful ways of kind of building school-wide buy-in for programs that work for them.
Yeah, and like it's such an interesting thing, because one thing I recommend you or the listeners do, if you're interested in social emotional learning, go to the New York Times and search social emotional learning and read just the articles they've written about it over the last decade or two, because they're really interesting. And like, I genuinely think now we can kind of see it's this weird kind of scammy self-help thing, but like it didn't always seem like that. And a lot of the time you read these articles and they're basically trying to teach kids like metacognition. So for instance, there'd be some sports game or something, and if it's football, two teams going against each other, and then after the game, the coach has been taught to gather the kids and say like, how do you guys think that game went? How did you feel during that game? Like, do you feel like you were kind of cooperating enough? Like it's kind of trying to give this higher level to the kids' thinking, and it's like an interesting question of whether that's a good idea. personally, I feel like in our current zeitgeist, we already have too much of that kind of stuff. But maybe like in an earlier age and for certain types of kids or certain situations, it can make sense to try and like just be a bit more thoughtful about behaviors at school.
Yeah, totally. And I think, look, there's a reason that there's sort of a natural interest in this type of thing. And I think that it also sort of explains why therapeutic culture has really just sort of, I think people want to know why they feel the way they feel, why they are the way they are. And especially kind of young people who are trying to sort of figure out what their role in the world is, we're sort of like handing them this ready-made framework. The problem there is this ready-made framework is a medical diagnosis or potential medical diagnosis. And I think that can be problematic. It can be sort of limiting to people because they might find their capacity for sort of self-control reduced. They might think that they have kind of less control over their outcomes and their circumstances. We definitely don't want to sort of like induce that in kids or make them think that something is wrong with them just by nature of experiencing the normal ups and downs of teenage life. And another problem that I have with this kind of therapy culture is it's very individual centered, and it's not kind of action based. So if we're only ever thinking about how we are feeling, that's not always useful. And I spoke to a lot of teachers and school professionals when I was writing this paper, and you hear stories all the time about teachers not wanting to even ask how kids are doing because they can tell the kid's not doing well, and then are you forcing this kid to sort of feel like they need to open up and just dump? How are they going to do their math problems after that? And so I think it can really detract from, actually providing a non-mental awareness environment. Like maybe it is good to give kids a break from thinking about how they feel and an opportunity to think about things other than what's going on in their life or at home or the challenges that they're facing, to learn something or be exposed to an interesting book or other concepts. So aside from it not being good for kids always, we're also asking a lot of teachers. We have some of the lowest reading comprehension levels right now. There's been a lot of learning loss from COVID. Teachers are burnt out, and we're asking them not only to kind of continue doing their academic teaching, but now incorporate all of these other concepts somehow into their coursework, to do all these different trainings. And a big problem, I think, with policy guidance, especially on the federal level, is there's a lot of push for developing these kind of comprehensive school-based mental health initiatives, but there's no clear guidance at all on what a comprehensive school-based mental health system looks like. We have screenings for like multiple different types of disorders. Should a school have a screening for depression and suicide and mental health generally? Does sort of having one cancel out the need for another? Does social emotional learning programs constitute mental health awareness programs? Like what actually should make up a comprehensive mental health system within schools? And it's not clear what does, which I think leaves schools really, really at a disadvantage trying to sort of sort through all of these different programs and decide what's worthwhile.
If the federal government hasn't already made that clear, right? It's not like superintendents or school board members are going to be best at that. And then, of course, if somebody comes to them with something fully packaged, just do this. This will solve all your problems. Then, and like all these organizations, they're great at using data to show things that, don't really exist. And it's all correlational kind of stuff. And it's very clever. I think a lot of them believe what they're doing is right too, which, I often feel when in conversations with those people, because I have to talk to them for work sometime, I just feel like there's an understanding kind of ceiling of like, they don't they get, well, we're our experts are showing us that this is true, and we can show you this data, and I've seen it with my own eyes, and there's just not that kind of higher level understanding of like, you need to be skeptical of that because we don't even know what we're talking about. Like, we haven't even defined our terms.
Yeah, I think defining terms is like totally missing from a lot of the conversation. So I totally agree with that. But also, I agree. I really can empathize with the idea that people are not bad intentioned, and people want to help kids as much as they can. And so everyone is just trying to pull the levers that they particularly have. So in the adult population with mental illness, you sometimes hear about judges mercy booking people into the criminal justice system because that's the only place that the judge might think the person can get access to mental health treatment. In the same way, you can empathize with a school counselor or a school psychologist who wants to sort of help a student get access to resources for mental health treatment if that's the lever that they can pull. And so, again, we shouldn't knock people for trying to do the right thing, but I think it would be worth setting up a better incentive structure around what makes the most sense. And one way I think we should do that is by kind of making it more clear what the roles and responsibilities of schools and the mental health system actually are.
I mean, that makes sense. You want clarity, but sometimes it seems to me like something more is going on here. I mean, we've been talking a lot about like pop psychology and stuff. I mean, but before, like, you used to have DARE, right? Like, you used to have in schools these more conservative coded, like, sort of well-being and kind of, I don't know if mental health is the right term, but basically trying to make sure kids are healthy and making good choices. And, you used to have basically like religion in schools, right? Schools would teach like Christian values, and some still do. And it just makes me think like maybe there kind of always is going to be this need for some way of thinking about how kids behave, why they behave that way, and what you do about it. And it can't, like, DARE was disproven to not really do much either. Like, the solutions that are most popular are often the ones that are like not exactly correlated with reality and don't exactly like match up with reality, because truth is most people in schools, like, they want, a nice story that explains this kid is having a bad time. It's not their fault. It's something outside. But if I, teach them differently, then they're going to be saved, right? And, it's this kind of narrative arc that is quite popular. And so maybe mental health is just kind of the newest version of that. Maybe when it leaves, something else will replace it. But mental health, it gives you that same power to explain, right? Oh, this person has issues because of trauma. And then, because of trauma, that's why they feel this way. That's why they make these actions, right? It takes away the accountability. And then it puts in the teacher or the school as the savior of like, well, now I can do something that will fix this or help this.
Just to sort of circle back to your first point, things like character development have always been present in public education in the US. You're not going to sort of avoid that because, yes, we have had periods where we focus maybe more than what people think is appropriate on academic learning, like reading and math. But again, this comes back to the idea that schools are social environments, right? They're environments where kids are learning and developing. And so, yeah, you're always going to have kind of some type of approach that informs how we think about how kids are developing. Is therapeutic education the best approach? That is where I'm more concerned.
Right. I mean, I'm almost thinking you could have a school, right? Like, you could have a school that teaches stoicism, for instance, if you wanted to, right? Like, it could be, instead of SEL or mental health stuff, you're basically getting stoicism. Like, this is what Marcus Aurelius said. We're going to all practice being, like solid like a rock for like a minute. Like, you could do all kinds of things like that. And I suppose this is one of the functions of school. And politically, right, there's always these debates about things, and nobody likes the other person's kind of character development / religious system like in their school, right? It's always like ours is good, yours is bad. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just seeing it a little bit as in relation to that, as like schools as institutions have these core functions. Because maybe like it'd be easy to say, let's just get, mental health, just get rid of it. And maybe that is the right thing because mental health in particular, these universal interventions are bad, but maybe something will still take its place. Like maybe it's kind of a vacuum that's always going to be filled by character, moral, whatever we want to call it, development.
Well, I think conservatives would make a case here for school choice and say something like parents should be able to make the decision about what type of character development or sort of informative framework their kids get exposed to. And I don't think that's a wrong or bad argument. I think, though, it's important to make sure we spell out what we think is appropriate for, just general, traditional neighborhood public schools, because a lot of times you have schools that are very under-resourced, and these policies are going to have, disproportionate impacts for good or bad on those schools. And something like providing mental health treatment in schools, when we know that there's a lot of low quality mental health treatment for youth out there, best practices are often not followed. We might disproportionately be exposing under-resourced schools to more harm. And so, that's a concern that I have with this approach. And we can potentially reduce that by making more clear the distinction between what is a school responsibility and what is a mental health system responsibility. So I do think getting mental health, if not out of schools, more clearly defined within schools is quite necessary.
Maybe we can talk a bit about, there's just so much good stuff in the report, but one thing I loved reading about was like just how the availability of mental health interventions changes this, just like almost like the incentives for like attendance and for talking to teachers and things. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I just thought like that's so relevant today.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, we have a very uneven distribution of where mental health providers are in the country. So coastal areas tend to have more mental health providers. And by that, I mean traditionally psychiatrists and psychologists, but also need can fluctuate. So we saw some higher reports of just general distress among youth during the pandemic. Those rates are going down. That sort of makes sense to us, right? Like COVID was pretty bad. Kids were isolated in their rooms. They're getting back out there now, interacting with each other. So one aspect of injecting mental health in schools through schools sort of directly employing mental health professionals or clinicians is that it kind of makes it harder to be adaptable when resource needs change. It might be better to see schools invest in long-term partnerships or relationships with community providers or universities where they have the ability to pull in more mental health resources if they need them. But then when they don't, or if they don't have those resources available to be put towards some other direction. Let's say you're a school, you have the capacity to hire 2 individuals, or you could use those fundings to spin up an art program. Maybe you use some of that funding to kind of build relationship with community providers and then give those community providers access to the school so that they can provide community-based mental health services in the school location. That way, problems of transportation are less of an issue. You kind of give students an opportunity to meet them where they are, but then you haven't sort of permanently constrained the school for hiring a mental health professional that in 2 years might be doing a lot less work and maybe then ends up sort of doing more administrative work around the school and isn't the best resources for the school. And then it might that professional may not be used most effectively. They have a certain skill set that's really valuable, and there are other schools that might have greater need for their services. And so having sort of brought them into the school setting through school employment kind of makes it stickier to change how we're allocating resources.
That's a great point. And I think like with a lot of these things, it's giving people options and then seeing what they actually do with it is great. I do think like people really are concerned about youth mental health, and maybe we can talk a little bit about the nature of that crisis more broadly, or lack of crisis, depending on your view. But like, if I'm just imagining a parent testifying before a school board, and let's say they've read your report and they agree with you, they're going to say, right, like, all these things that we're doing, they don't really work well, and in fact, they can cause these harms. And I think the school's response, if they don't believe you, I hope they do believe you, and they, but I almost feel like they're going to say something like, well, I've seen it work, right? Like, my personal experience has shown that actually this is effective. And I imagine for a lot of teachers or people in the community who've seen this stuff, who've done this stuff, participated, I'm guessing that even though there are, and I've talked to as well, like a lot of people who really object to this, there's also a lot of people who seem to really, really like it. So like, what would you say to people who say, you give them this evidence and they say, yeah, studies, they say this, they say that, but I've done it myself. I kind of see what it's like, and I know this is helping kids for me to be doing these things.
Yeah, well, one interesting sort of comparison is that you hear about therapists, in fact, saying that they know what works for their patients, but then go on to practice types of therapy that have no evidence basis. So just an interesting comparison. Here's what I'll say. I don't want to tell a local education system what works for them. I think it's important to flag what trade-offs exist. If you are just told, this program in our study was not effective, but it shows promise, and you're not given a clear sense of what you might get instead, then it's a lot harder to kind of make a call about what the best allocation of resources are. So for a school that might tell me, I've seen this work, I know this is good for students, that's great. Then, locality should continue to do what's working for them, but they should also, and policymakers and researchers have a responsibility to do this. They should also be made aware of what else is out there so that they know what might be a better option. Maybe there isn't a better option. Maybe this is the only thing that a school has the capacity to do. And if that's the case, then they're going to make that choice. But mental health services are sort of hard to provide, and it seems like there are other, again, sort of structural options that would be easier for schools to do and potentially more impactful.
It's almost a bit like, if you're talking to a Keynesian economist versus a classical economist and you're like in a depression, right? Like the classical economist would be like, just don't do anything. Like, it'll work itself out. Anything you do will make it worse. The Keynesian says, oh no, like start spending, like you can do this, you can do that. And we all know which is the better message and which message people like more, and which is, proven to be popular. So I totally agree with you. Like, I really feel like talking about these things, and when I talk about them, I'm often way too negative. And people need to have a positive alternative. And I think, some of the ideas you laid out in your report, like making schools, open more often, things like school lunches, like all of these are good ideas. And especially if you're on board with mental health, you say, I believe it's important. I just think, we should really be focused on the kids who need it the most and getting, them the treatment they need. Like, I think there needs to be more of a structured kind of positive vision. And that's why I like your report and in general, the stuff that you do, because you're actually offering that. You're not just saying like, let the economy crash. You're saying like, I recognize like that these are problems and I'm going to actually try and give some solutions. Otherwise, I just think there's no hope of winning anybody over, unfortunately.
Well, thank you for saying that. I feel like I can be sort of negative sometimes. I'm like, stop doing this thing. But I think, look, schools and teachers and all of the really well-intended, hardworking people that staff these really important places for kids, they want to do what's right for kids. They want to help kids. And, whether or not we provide mental health awareness training or social emotional learning is not going to change the fact that teachers still care about student well-being. They don't need a curriculum to communicate that. And so it's all about kind of what the particular approach is. And I think that's why schools have been, feeling so almost pressured to take on the failures of the mental health system, because they know that their students are not going to get help otherwise. And so, again, it comes back to accountability. Schools, I think, should be very reluctant to take this on, because it then sort of lets the mental health system off the hook, and it lets policymakers off the hook for sort of implementing mental health policies that address the challenges that are most pressing. So I get why schools sort of want to bring this on. I don't know that they should.
Yeah, and I think letting mental health system off the hook is a great point too, because in my opinion, there are a lot of mental health interventions that are, positive, that could be made way more accessible than they currently are. And, as you've written about with Stephen Ide and stuff, for serious mental illness, we're barely scratching the surface of what we could be doing. A lot of things, even for less serious mental illness, I think, you could make it way easier and more affordable for people to access therapy, CBT, whatever it might be. And, for kids, it's obviously a bit more complicated, but we shouldn't necessarily let them off the hook either, and just, assume that schools have to kind of take on everything. I get why schools try and do it. Obviously, anyone will do anything to help kids, right? And the motivation for schools is fundamentally care and empathy. And so, of course, we'll do anything to help, kids and try and prevent them from being sad or depressed or anxious or whatever it might be. But yeah, you also have to be prudent about what can and can't be accomplished.
That is, I think, the critical point here. We are not going to eradicate sadness. And so it's really important when we are, teaching kids about what a normal emotional response is to something. We should not. The problem with a lot of this mental health push is that we're almost promoting wellness as just greater increase in positive affect. Happiness is not the only virtue that makes for a meaningful life. And in fact, kids need to learn that it's valuable sometimes and feels good to get through a challenge or solve a problem. It makes you feel capable of doing more, or you learn about something else that you're interested in. And so one problem with this is that we are kind of pushing this narrative that we'll do anything to make the kids happy, because happiness is the thing that matters. Okay, my kid is anxious about going to school. I won't make them go to school because it's going to make them anxious. In the long run, that's actually going to be worse, because maybe a child develops greater anxiety about going. And so we have to kind of balance what an appropriate response is. Yes, you're going to feel anxious some days. I mean, think about all the emotions you could feel in a given day, and now pretend you're a 16-year-old again and in school, bored or hungry, or, looking at the cute person across from you. You're feeling all of these different things. Happiness is not going to be one of them all day long. So understanding that we kind of have these range of emotions and range of feelings about different experiences is really important. So one of the teachers that I spoke with actually was my ninth or 10th grade English teacher. She was so great, Sarah Nazarian, and she was, a trusted adult in my life. I learned a lot from her, and I was a little bit of a pretentious student. We had a student teacher at one point, and the student teacher gave me a B. And I was so upset that I went to Sarah Nazarian and I said, she gave me this B, change my grade. And she was like, Carolyn, get a real problem. And I was so upset that I went home and told my dad, who thought it was so funny that he said, yeah, get a real problem. And even to this day, when I'm complaining to my dad about things, sometimes he's like, Carolyn, do you need to get a real problem? And I'm like, yeah, probably. But as like a 15-year-old, if I was not told this is not a real problem, I might have actually come to, consider that be something worth getting very stressed out about. Kids feel a lot of pressure about colleges. I mean, I know I was concerned that getting a B would, limit my ability to get into a good college, which would then totally impact my ability to get a good job, and then my future's ruined. We need to be able to kind of level set with kids. And I think the mental health narrative and push is making teachers afraid to, tell kids like it is a little bit and give them some, not even tough love, but just kind of clarity around what's okay to feel bad about and what's not, or maybe sort of what that range might look like or what matters. We've taken that away from teachers. We have also sort of taken that away from parents, because parents are afraid to sort of say anything. So this is like the problematic aspect of therapy culture that I worry about.
I worry about it too. And to some degree, I feel like I grew up in it. I feel like it almost is my culture. And it's, there'll even be times where out in normal life, I'll just instinctively be defending it. And then I'll just be like, wait, is this like what I really believe? Right. And I think part of what's happening too, as you're pointing out, is the teachers, the administrators, the people at school, also a lot of them now grew up in this culture, right? Or maybe they didn't grow up in it, but maybe that's what they were into as a teenager, and then it appealed to them. And so like there's also that aspect of, it's just different people who have their own different beliefs. And I think we're seeing kind of increasing fragility and decreasing ability to say, this doesn't matter, this isn't a big deal. No, and that's certainly going to be an issue, just because like in the real world, there is more feedback that you get. And I've seen a lot of people, my own peers and a bit younger than me, struggle with that, honestly, as they come out of, say, high school and even college these days, frankly, and they go into the real world. And suddenly they're working for some, Gen X or Boomer, and they're being told bluntly, you did that wrong, like this. And a lot of them, it's challenging. And I think these are ideological problems as much as they are demographic problems. And but ultimately, one would hope we could, figure out a balance and be able to be caring and be kind and empathetic, while also, having the right amount of judgment, giving the right amount of feedback, and holding people to the right amount of accountability.
I totally agree. And I think we should be aware of just how far, we're swinging the pendulum in either direction. I recounted this story to this teacher when I spoke with her writing this report, and she was shocked that she said that. She was like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I told that to you. I would never say that to a student now. And I was like, I think about this all the time. Like, you did something very, very useful for me. And it honestly made me sort of sad that, this great teacher was sort of worried about not wanting to impact someone's mental health, when in reality, sort of helping them understand a B is okay is really useful. So yeah, I think there's a healthy medium between sort of being supportive and telling people what life is, which is a lot of times showing up and just doing things that you don't want to do and getting them done on time. And that's kind of how you can be successful a lot of times in society. So a lot of that's necessary.
By the way, like, thinking about it now, obviously a great mental health intervention would be if schools could fire bad teachers. Like, I think part of my orientation, just being skeptical of education, began in grade 1. I had the worst teacher. She would yell at us, and she was like a terrible woman. And all the parents complained about her, but she couldn't be fired, basically. And I think probably that was really bad for, my mental health at the time. I was basically scared to go to school because I knew me and my friends were going to get bullied by the teacher. Right. And
what that says to me is that it would be better for education resources to go towards education purposes than towards mental health purposes. That in and of itself would be better for people's mental health.
I think so, because, to your point about education being very social, it's like you're with the people you're with, right? And that's why also, I don't know if anyone has done the study. This could be a good thing actually for you to do, but, whether school choice improves mental health in any way. Because I just know so many people who were in schools that really didn't work for them, and they're miserable, and they found a school that was great for them, and then they're happy. And I assume millions and millions of kids are missing out on that opportunity. But with the time that we got left, I just want to talk really quickly. I want to get your kind of take. So you said you're sort of skeptical of the youth mental health crisis kind of narrative. Is that correct?
I think there are definitely some problems going on. Suicide rates of self-harm, they have increased. Numbers are still low, to be clear. We see higher suicide rates among, for example, older men. And you hear things like suicide is the third leading cause of death among kids. But think about that for a second. Like, what else are kids dying from? So we should contextualize this a little bit. We should certainly be concerned, but the reason I don't want to call it a mental health crisis is because I don't want to promote mental health treatment when other treatment, quote unquote, might be more appropriate, which would be other interventions that are, again, structural, or literacy programs, or more recess opportunities. Mental health treatment, given what we know about how little effect it can have on youth and some harmful effect it can have on youth, should not be our go-to. There's a paper by a prominent psychiatrist, Alan Francis, called, I think, No Treatment as the Prescription of Choice. And I think that's a useful way to think about this.
Interesting. So what you're kind of saying is that, like, the trends for certain issues are going up, but overall, it's not a crisis in the same way that COVID was a crisis, because COVID pretty much affected everybody. And for the younger generation, it's, mostly affecting a smaller, say, percentage of people.
Well, what is mental health? That might be a useful place to start. If we're calling this a mental health crisis, how do we define mental health? This is another problem I kind of have with mental health policy. Like, what is mental health? Like, what constitutes someone as mentally healthy? In my mind, mentally healthy means you are experiencing emotions that are normal for whatever your circumstance might be. We just had a difficult period for kids when they were highly isolated. So it might be normal to expect that rates of distress are higher in these sort of difficult periods. That would be kind of normal to me. What might be abnormal? Those are sort of the things that I think we should be thinking about a little bit more. Of course, things like suicide and self-harm are very concerning, but what's the right treatment for that? And unfortunately, with things like suicide, there's been a lot of research done to try to predict kind of what will cause suicide. It's very hard to predict because it's very rare. And so suicide prevention programs are going to be inherently limited for that reason. But again, have this trade-off of sort of making us think more about the idea of suicide. And then we're exposed to this idea. And then do we think it's normal? Are more people actually trying to do this? And, is it normal for me to try to do this? There are consequences to normalizing these problematic behaviors, tragic behaviors, and abnormal behaviors.
Right. So I do hear that. I think the question is for instance, if we said there was a AIDS crisis, we're referring to the fact that a lot of people are getting AIDS, right? Whereas a mental health crisis, do a lot of people actually have diagnosable mental health issues, right?
Yes. And is the diagnosis even a useful measure? I mean, we're diagnosing a lot these days. It doesn't take much to kind of meet the criteria for a diagnosis of a mental disorder in the DSM. But is that particular diagnosis itself abnormal? Depression is a good example. It's very, very common. And there were some debates when the last version of the DSM was edited as to whether it was appropriate to sort of include grief after the death of a loved one, for example, as a disorder. Well, let's think about how we should consider that in terms of being a normal emotional reaction. And so, the point being, sort of meeting criteria for a diagnosis in and of itself may not necessarily imply that you have functional impairment from a mental disorder.
Yeah, I also see some like a little bit of relativism around this where like when I was I studied psychology, when I was in school, they would basically say, you know, a mental illness in the DSM, it doesn't have to be impairing to be a mental illness, say, right? You could, you know, have it and actually be fine. And then it's kind of like, well, okay, well, once you get there, then what if someone says, well, I'm pretty much fine, but I'm a little iffy. And I think like to some degree, I mean, there's kind of like, especially when it comes to therapy and to drugs and stuff, there's kind of like this weird libertarian intersection where it becomes like, well, maybe like if you just feel kind of distracted and you want to be able to focus more, like you should have, like, it's okay to have a drug for that. Maybe if you feel kind of on edge all the time and you want to chill out, you should just take a drug for that. But I mean, that's its whole own conversation. But I guess kind of what you're getting at is like, we have all these trends going up, say for the amount of people getting diagnosed. We've got some smaller trends for the amount of people actually, you know, committing these serious behaviors. I think what people are mostly talking about when they're saying a mental health crisis is like the number of kids who seem kind of like out of it and kind of depressive. I almost want to say depressive more than like clinically depressed. And I think that because we've kind of broadened the definitions, now that is kind of a thing. Personally, for me, I see that. I feel like that's a big thing for my generation. It might also just be it could be a cultural difference. It could be that we're just way more open about it than people were in the past. And ultimately, I don't think we'll ever really know because there's so many looping effects, feedback effects of one thing getting normalized. So it becomes a social thing. So it's open. So people do it and then they get treatment. And then that creates like, I don't know if we'll ever know the answer, but yeah, I think it's interesting to hear your perspective on that. And probably that's where we should start. And then we should from there say, are there any really big things that we can really point at and say this is a really huge problem?
Yeah, so I think historical trends of self-reported happiness, at least for the adult population, are pretty stable. I think one metric that has changed is the seriousness that parents report of their children having challenges. So parents are reporting, I think, at a higher rate, higher seriousness for their kids, even though kids are not necessarily reporting that. And SAMHSA just released data for the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, and they use a measure that sort of tries to get at distress that might be diagnosed in the DSM. So it's sort of misleadingly called a major depressive episode. What constitutes as a major depressive episode in this survey is a 2-week period of feeling sad or lonely or unmotivated. Again, what are sort of our thresholds here? When I was a 17-year-old, I could totally have seen myself having a 2-week period of feeling anxious or self-conscious or, uninterested. But that said, over 80% of youth between 12 and 17 did not report a single 2-week period during which they were distressed. And so that context is worth remembering as well. Yes, it's a problem if, a fifth of young people are not happy or feeling stressed or are so distressed that they're feeling like they can't participate in their typical life activities. That's a problem, sure, but let's contextualize it a little bit. Let's sort of try to understand what we might expect of people that age. Yeah.
And you've never gotten more attention for being unhappy. Like this is a totally unprecedented thing where if you are unhappy, genuine, like, and it's weird to even say the word genuinely or not, because it's all subjective, right? Like you could be like, the cause of these things is nebulous to everybody most of the time. So, but for whatever reason, if you're unhappy and you're a teen, bam, you can get out of classes. Bam, you can go sleep in the nurse's office anytime you want. Bam, you're getting all these people asking you about how you're doing, right? What's going on with you? And like for any person, that is definitely going to change their behavior, and it's going to change, right, their actions. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's a great point. You got the 80% who are like, I'm pretty much fine. You've got 20%. So much has changed in the last, 20, 30 years that it would almost be surprising if there wasn't some effect. And all the accommodations and things that have been brought about too, like those are totally going to change how people think about themselves, how people behave. And so, yeah, it's a nebulous problem. I think like the social media stuff, I think is interesting. And I'm kind of halfway on that. I think that probably for that 20%, that could be have had some negative effects, but I don't think for the 80% it has.
Yeah, the research on this definitely shows differences by subgroups. So, for whatever reason, people who come from religious families tend to be doing better off, and also conservative households. But girls seem to be impacted a lot more by time spent on social media. So is it problematic? Potentially. I personally could support, no phones in schools, just because it crowds out time spent on actually interacting with other kids. And if nothing else, it's sort of distracting in the classroom for teachers even, which makes teachers' jobs harder. So regardless of whether or not social media is harmful, I think there could be a case to be made for, not having phones on in schools, and not in the classroom. Think about interactions in the hallways or at lunch. If people are all on their phones and not talking to each other, those are also sort of valuable social in-between times that matter. So I like the idea of not having phones in schools, but I also very much appreciate that this is challenging for a lot of localities, and I think schools need to do what's right for them. If they're not going to get parental buy-in and there's going to be a lot of pushback, those are sort of things that they have to consider. But it's great when you sort of hear about these grassroots efforts from parents to decide that the school will be phone-free, and we are hearing about that more.
Yeah, that's one where it's like, that seems like a no-brainer to me, like, especially if you've got a school where it's a big issue, which like a lot of schools it is, right? That seems like a no-brainer. Just get rid of distractions. I think there should definitely be more. I think there should be more control for individual users over things. That's harder to actually push, because then you're basically trying to influence like these companies. But personally, I think it would be great to have like for instance, I'm a Mac user. The screen time settings on Mac are like terrible. Like they basically give you all these ways to like keep using it. And I would like if it actually was like, no, you're locked out for like this amount of time or something. Like I think there's little things like that could be done that just would help people manage their screen time better. So overall, like I think it's good that the attention has been brought to it. I think it's a little bit overblown in terms of like the whole kind of science behind it. But at the same time, I do think it's true that obviously, like, this is a huge change. Obviously, this has blown a lot of kids' minds in a bad way, and we should be able to have a conversation about how to help them.
I think one thing that's not overblown, Jonathan Haidt talks about this. Generally, we sort of overprotect kids in the physical world and underprotect kids online. I think that's absolutely true. And look, there's just so much opportunity for a little mistake to become hugely problematic for a kid. You make one bad decision about something that you post, and millions of people might have seen that. And I think it's not, I don't know if it's worth exposing kids to that level of risk when they're learning about what a good decision and a bad decision is. Are we going to ban social media for kids? I don't know. But, these are just sort of trade-offs that we have to think about. And I think one kind of useful aspect of, especially what Jonathan Haidt is doing, is sort of saying, like, here is some concrete thing that we could try to change that might make an impact. And to your point about, us not wanting to say, let's just not do this thing. What are kind of things that we can actually change, or levers that we can actually pull to try to make a difference. We see there's a problem out there. Some kids seem to be upset. Social media seems to have some relationship with this distress. Maybe this is something worth trying. And we got to try things to know what works and what doesn't.
Carolyn, we're out of time, but I just want to say thanks for coming on. It's want to do this for a while, and the new report is out at Manhattan Institute. Go check it out. It's a great read. Also some great graphs, which I'll be sharing on Twitter probably when it comes out. So yeah, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Jonah.